Hello, all. My name is Devany Savage, and I am an intern for the Alliance for Positive Youth Development. I'm here with Shantel Vachani, and we're going to be speaking about education reform and juvenile justice. Just to give you a little bit of background about Shantel, she received her law degree from UCLA School of Law with an emphasis on public interest law. She also received her master's degree in social welfare from the UCLA School of Social Welfare with a concentration in macro practice. She is an education attorney. She works on trainings and policy issues related to court-involved youth, and she has worked on projects such as the School to Prison Pipeline Reversal Project. She's well informed on matters that involve youth, education, and the system. So I want to give her the opportunity to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Devini, and thank you for providing me the time to talk about such an important issue. And as you mentioned, I am an education attorney and also a social worker. And when I was in law school, trying to kind of figure out what I was going to do, I was doing my clinical internship as a social worker, and they would send me, I was at an agency that worked with kids in child welfare for the Department of Mental Health, and they would send me to IEPs and meetings for kids that had suicidal ideation or were homeless in foster care with serious trauma issues and learning related issues. And I didn't really have any training on how to advocate or understand the school resources available. And so when I started to understand and identify that, when I graduated, I started to kind of put together how we could bring together the legal system, the education system, and support court involved youth. And so there wasn't a job at the time like that. And so I was able to create a program and develop it called the School to Prison Pipeline Reversal Project. And that's kind of how I got started as an education attorney, working on issues of school push out, school discipline, and what we're going to talk about today, kind of climate issues in the school environment. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Um, so I want to start by discussing the school climate and better outcomes for youth. So how does school climate impact the school to prison pipeline?
Yes, I think when we think about climate, anytime if you want to grow something, you have to have a healthy environment. So if you want to grow plants, you have to work on the soil. And I think a school climate is exactly the same thing. And so we have to think if we want kids to learn, we have to create conducive learning environments for them to learn. And I think that's common knowledge. The challenge is we've created a system over the last 20 or 30 years to really make it less than conducive for in many schools, for many students to not be able to learn. Either they don't feel safe or they don't have the resources. And so I think context matters. And so I'm going to take it back just a second to think about how we got here. When we were not always using the word school to prison pipeline, we've probably started hearing that since 2007 or 8, but it started well before that. So in the early 90s, we began kind of the school shootings and Columbine. And out of that came policy. This was during the war on drugs, the end of the war on drugs, kind of the period where we were tough on crime, high juvenile crime, kind of the predator type of mentality. And with that, they passed the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994. And that essentially took the language from the war on drugs of zero tolerance and put it into education. And that eventually became the No Child Left Behind and education student success. And so thinking about education policy, but with an approach of discipline and zero tolerance. And so what that manifested into is what we are seeing now when we talk about school climate, which is having more police officers and probation officers in schools than counselors. And to give you an example of school climate and what that can look like, as an education attorney one day, I was at a high school in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley, waiting for an IEP for a student who was about to get expelled himself. He had a disability and he had a manifestation of his disability. He acted out. And so I was there, and all of a sudden I saw a bunch of kids running, like 30 kids just running. And I was with a friend and asking, why are they all running in different directions? And I told him it actually kind of looks like an immigration raid. Why are they all running? And all of a sudden I look and I see a guy on a cart. It's one of their school resource officers. And that's how they do tardy sweeps at this particular school. And I won't name the school, but they had a population of 4,000 students. They had 2 probation officers that were school-based to support the kids on probation or at risk. They had 4 resource officers, and they had an LAPD officer that would come and check in. At that school, they had 4 counselors. 4 school counselors, and they were academic counselors, and 1 social worker that they shared with other schools. So to put that in perspective, the only way that they could manage truancy, tardiness, or any of these kind of aberrations was to use the resources that they invested in. So if you invest in those resources, the climate is going to be exactly as you create it. And so in that particular high school, as many others just like it, the school climate was created because administration chose to discipline and invest on the kind of authoritarian side instead of really thinking about what were the kids' needs. Why were they out there? Why weren't they going to school? And to take it a little further, when we think about school to prison pipeline and school climate, what's going to happen to those kids after a few times they get ticketed? A few of them get it, they get suspensions, eventually they get expelled. Where do they go? Kids don't continue to come to school if the climate is not such that they're welcome there. And so then they stop coming. And that's usually when they became my clients when I was working on that project. Once they got arrested because they were out in the community, usually during school hours, because they either no longer welcome or no longer want to be in that environment. So school climate has everything to do with school push out, school discipline, and entering the juvenile justice system and what we now call the school to prison pipeline. So a little long in response to talk about school climate has everything to do with it.
No, thank you. I'm glad you touched on that because I think there's like a recent statistic that said that about like 71% of schools in America have cops, or police officers on campus, but no nurses or school social workers or therapeutic counselors. So it's just interesting because the school is in a unique position to directly effectuate change in students' lives and promote self-efficacy. So if we chose, like you said, to invest more in resources that help kids thrive, there could be better outcomes. So I feel like because of this, education reform is imperative. It's necessary, especially for youth who come from, adverse circumstances. So you touched on it a little bit, but can you speak a little on how education reform can impact juvenile justice and what that might look like?
Absolutely. So there's kind of a movement in this country, and I love the direction it's going in because 10 years ago, people said school to prison pipeline. And I remember doing trainings to judges and lawyers and counselors and officers, and they just kind of laughed at me. And now everybody acknowledges, even when I was a professor and I would ask students, they didn't know what it was, even though they work in schools. Now everybody can acknowledge that this is a crisis. They don't exactly agree on how we can address it. And so I'm going to give you an example of something that happened at a school 8 years ago, and then talk about how now that school is addressing it really differently. So I had a student, and he was a client of mine. He was in foster care because he had just revealed that his paternal grandfather had been sexually abusing him since he was 6 years old, and he was 14 at the time. And he was also exploring his sexual identity and kind of a little bit confused on a lot of things as a 14-year-old. He came out, and what we know about kids that come out, he came out about the sexual abuse. And so after that, he was triggered on the daily. He was very upset. He was also going through the foster care system, having to testify against his grandfather in criminal court. So he obviously had a lot of trauma coming out, and he was receiving very little support since they didn't have a school social worker. They had one that they shared for different schools and was there one day a week. And so what would happen is he'd get very upset in the middle of class. Somebody would irritate him. He was very irritable at the time. And he was a big kid, very sweet, genuinely teddy bear kid, but big, 6 feet, maybe 300 pounds. And so he would get upset and he would walk out like this and run. He would run to the field, the baseball field, and he would cry in the middle of the field, just screaming because of the anger and the trauma. And because people were scared of him, one, and two, because they didn't actually have anybody trained to help him, they would send their school resource officer. This particular school, they had a precinct, an LAPD precinct actually on site, as well as the probation officer. So they would send the officer, and he is crying, he's screaming, he's obviously manifesting the trauma, and they're handcuffing him. And we would see this over and over. So finally, we asked for an emergency education IEP. We were able, in his case, to get him a lot of supports, get an emergency IEP, get him out of that school into a non-public school that really, truly was going to address his mental health needs as well as his educational needs. He was reading at a 13th grade level, and he'd never passed a class since kindergarten. Very smart, but because of the trauma. So that's how we handled it as an education attorney. But 8-9 years later, this school has jumped on to the Dignity in Schools campaign, has really worked with the education advocacy organizations here in Los Angeles, and is now a whole nother world. Now the way they handle it is through restorative justice circles, healing circles. They've implemented very fully and wholeheartedly. They've changed administration. They've implemented positive behavioral implementations and supports, and what they call kind of the universal triangle. So if you think of education advocacy, education needs of kids, we have this triangle, and at the bottom right here we have 80% of the kids. 80% of the kids, if you just do universal best practice, you support them. Everybody's trained in socio-emotional learning, in what is kind of how to, universal support in classrooms, giving kids time to have outlets. 80% of your kids will be just fine. And we know that through research. And then in the middle tier, which is this middle tier here, it's about 10%. Those are the kids that are going to need a little bit more intervention, and those are the group interventions. That might be pulling out with the counselor, having some IEP counseling or something like that. So it's a small percent, but it's usually a group intervention. And if we do it right, we'll be fine. And then there's this 5 to 10% at the top, and usually it's red, green, and yellow and green. And that percentage is where schools typically have invested all of their mental health resources, all of their social work resources, everything. And it usually centers around discipline. So if you get to that point, it's because there is some serious underlying needs and they're acting out. But at this point, if you're investing all of your resources for this 5%, the other 80, 90 is not getting what they need. And so the school has flipped that and really started to invest their resources on universal best practice of socio-emotional learning, of restorative justice, of doing circles for everybody. So in the classroom, all the teachers are getting trained on this. And so it really is a movement across the country. And Los Angeles has really, because we were at a crisis point and there were a lot of lawsuits to address this, has really done a better job. And this particular school where this young man used to be at is really taking the lead. So I think that's important to note. I also think that education advocates have worked closely, at least here in Los Angeles and across the country as well, with community organizers, with parents, and really made this a grassroots movement. And instead of just looking at education reform, they've looked at a much bigger scope. So at this particular school, the same school that had lots of problems in LA County, we had a problem of truancy tickets, and they were giving them out like candy. And what they found out many years ago was that they were only giving them out in Black and brown communities in Title I schools. And they did that through data. They did that through Freedom of Information Act requests. A community organization was able to map this. Then they created a group of community students at high schools to form focus groups to identify what was pushing kids out of school. They took all that, they wrote reports, and then they created small wins. And the first one was address the way in which we're giving truancy tickets. Because what they used to do is the officers would wait at the buses when the kids were getting off the buses. And in Los Angeles, we're notorious for having a very poor transportation system, so you're always late. And then they would take them, and then they would take them onto campus, parade them through, and then put them in the gym and process them the entire day. Hundreds of kids getting these tickets that were $250. And in order to clear them, they would need to go to court and bring their parents, most of them that have 2 to 3 jobs and can't take the day off. And they would, if they didn't address that, they would rise in fees, and they could not get jobs, driver's licenses. So this was happening for years. And so the community really came together with the schools, with the organizations, but it was really the push of the community and then the education advocates. So we're looking at education advocacy in a lot of different ways, but we're looking at community climate, school climate, special education advocacy. The same group partnered up with attorneys at the ACLU and public counsel and others to work on legislative fixes. So we also found out that after doing a lot of research, that 70 to 80% of suspensions and expulsions in Los Angeles were coming out of something called willful defiance. It was this kind of code word for anything. So you're not looking at me right. I don't like the way you're looking at me, talking to me, what you're wearing. And so what they were able to do at the legislative level, at the state legislative level, is change the legislation. It was an entire statewide campaign. They started with just the lower grades, and they eventually, just a few weeks ago, have expanded it all the way through in this legislative cycle. And so since this legislation has passed, we have seen a 60, I believe, percent drop in suspensions and expulsions because of willful defiance. We've also seen increasing graduation rates. So there is a correlation between education reform and educational success. And we're really, I think, approaching it from a variety of ways, and it has to be a community effort. And I think Los Angeles is doing an amazing job really integrating the reform effort. So yeah, that's a little bit about it.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. And
Absolutely.
um, I think that, again, why social workers are so important is because we can kind of understand the intricacies of, kids' behavior. And I think,
Yeah.
in the beginning, you spoke about how sometimes trauma can manifest in learning disabilities and,
Absolutely.
or just in general, punishing behavior that would otherwise be normal behavior for kids.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it's interesting that we have stuck, so strongly to this one size fits all when it comes to curriculums in
Yeah.
schools. And you spoke on it a little about how sometimes the schools will directly address or not necessarily cater to, but serve a certain type, a certain population, very small
Yeah.
percent though. And then all these other kids end up, getting lost somewhere in the system. And so
Yeah.
I agree that appropriate, training and, diversity and inclusion, cultural competency is important. And I think where we can address that is at the policy level. Um,
Absolutely.
and so, again, thank you so much for that. I guess I just
Absolutely.
want to leave our listeners with maybe some ways that they could get involved. I know you mentioned a little bit about community organizing.
Yeah, so I think so there's a national movement, and you can go on to Dignity in Schools, I think .org maybe, and they're, I think, headquartered in Washington D.C., and then they have state chapters and local chapters. And on that, they have local chapters that work on different issues that are local to the community, as what it looks like to address school to prison pipeline and support students. And so that's one, just as a general thing. And then if you're here actually it can be anywhere, but it's based out of California. Public Counsel Law Center, which is where I used to work at as an education attorney, has teamed up with a bunch of different groups, community groups, as well as policymakers, as well as schools, to form a website, kind of a informational website called fixschooldiscipline.org. So fixschooldiscipline.org. And on this particular website, and I used to send my students, my social work students, to this website all the time, because not only do they keep you updated on the reform efforts around the country, but they also give you model templates. So for example, San Francisco was able to work with, in San Francisco Unified, to work on creating a better relationship between law enforcement and the schools. And they have a consent decree, or I mean, a model kind of MOU. And so all of those documents that different attorneys and advocates and community organizers their successes are getting posted there. Every legislative fix, model language, if you're in another state and you wanted to create similar legislation to address willful defiance in your state, you can take that, if you are an advocate, and work on it and model it and adapt it to what your needs are. So that website has a lot of information, also has a lot of stories. It has youth stories, hundreds of youth stories, and it also gives you opportunities to click on to get involved, whether that's through, doing something online or showing up at an event. And so I think that's a really great one. And I'm just going to give you one other one. This
Okay.
is actually a lawsuit that public counsel with some private attorneys filed against Compton Unified School District a few years ago. And it's the Peter P. lawsuit, but everybody knows it as the Trauma and Learning lawsuit. And this specific lawsuit was really important because lawyers and social workers and everybody kind of teamed up with the community and said, how can we go about addressing this at a more universal level? And so they filed a lawsuit against Compton Unified, the entire school district, and they used the new legal challenge that instead of addressing individually a young person's needs, they said that the entire district of Compton Unified School was not addressing the socio-emotional needs. And because of the high levels of complex trauma in the entire community, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is rarely used in this setting, then Compton Unified was failing to address the needs of individuals with disabilities because of this complex trauma. And so I'm simplifying it, but essentially it's never been tested, this legal theory. And the remedies were created by psychologists, social work. The dean of one of the deans of field at USC School of Social Work helped to write the remedies, served as the expert witnesses, and all of the remedies look exactly like what we talked about earlier: restorative justice circles, mental health training for everybody, up from the janitors all the way to the administrators. And so you can actually go on the website, because they created an informational website for individuals. They have a bibliography of journals and articles and all of the documents from the lawsuit, the declarations from all of the expert witnesses. Everything is on there, including videos from the youth plaintiffs. So it's a really informational website. So if you're trying to learn how to get involved and what the problems are, I think that's a really great starting point. So traumaandlearning.org is the website.
Thank you so much. I know sometimes it's so hard to keep up with everything that's going on, but as you said, there's actually a movement, going on right now, especially in Los Angeles. So I feel like people who are interested in helping, youth and are interested in youth development would love to check out these sites. So thank you so much for that information, and thank you so much again for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I'm really excited to continue the movement, working with youth activists, social workers, attorneys, policymakers. And we all need to be in on this to make any difference.
Exactly. So be sure to, I just want to take a moment. Be sure to follow our social media accounts as we advocate for youth, and join us for our Invest in Youth campaign for Youth Justice Awareness Month. The campaign hashtag is hashtag Invest in Youth. And again, thank you all for tuning in.
All right, thank you.